Welcome to Exceptionally Speaking, the podcast where we explore how to better understand and support exceptional learners. I'm Dr. Meryl, and each week I sit down with dedicated educators, parents, and advocates to share real strategies, inspiring stories, and moments of hope. If you're enjoying these conversations or learning something new, please be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Today, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Linda Silverman, a pioneering voice in gifted education and psychology. Dr. Silverman is a licensed clinical and counseling psychologist and the founder and director of the Institute for the Study of Advanced Development and its subsidiary, the Gifted Development Center in Westminster, Colorado. Over the last 46 years, she has studied more than 6,600 gifted children, the largest data bank of its kind. Her work has shaped the field's understanding of advanced development, visual spatial learners, and twice exceptional students. She has written hundreds of articles and chapters and authored foundational books, including Counseling the Gifted and Talented, Upside Down Brilliance, The Visual Spatial Learner, Advanced Development, a collection of works on gifted adults, and of course, Giftedness 101, which has been translated into multiple languages. She also founded Advanced Development, the only juried psychological journal devoted to adult giftedness, and helped create the checklist for recognizing twice exceptional children. In our conversation, we focus on profoundly gifted children, how they differ from gifted and highly gifted peers, and why a one-size-fits-all view of giftedness doesn't work. Dr. Silverman shares a special education lens for understanding the far end of the IQ continuum, talks candidly about mental health risks and asynchronous development, and debunks common myths, like the idea that profoundly gifted kids are 1 in a million, that gifted education is inherently elitist, or that profound giftedness and autism are the same thing. She also offers clear guidance for families seeking the right educational fit and highlights communities like the Davidson Institute, Epsilon Camp, and PG Retreat as powerful sources of connection and support. You can find more information about all our guests at hex24press.com. Please enjoy Exceptionally Speaking with Dr. Linda Silverman.
Hey, Linda, it is so good to see you. Thank you for being on Exceptionally Speaking today.
Thank you for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this.
Me too. I know we have so much that we could talk about, and today I'm really excited to dive into our conversation about profoundly gifted children. Before we get into that, would you just share a little bit about your background and what really inspired your lifelong work in the field of gifted education?
Well, this is my life's mission. Unlike a lot of gifted educators who say that they came into this field because they had a gifted child or they were working with gifted children, I had this as my life mission from the time I was 17. And I really believe that I was chosen by Lita Hollingworth to continue her work. So for me, it's a sacred mission.
That's wonderful. I'm really curious about all the work and experience you have with profoundly gifted children. And I'd like to hear more around when you're explaining the difference between gifted, highly gifted, profoundly gifted. I think a lot of people have a more narrow view of giftedness and think of it as just one thing. If you're gifted, you're gifted. And we know that's not necessarily true. And so we'd love for you to start with kind of what's the difference there when we talk about those terms.
I like to use the metaphor of special education. That is my background and training. And so I look at gifted as the opposite end of the same continuum, the same coin as intellectual disability. And if we look at the other end of the spectrum, we see that it isn't a matter of you are intellectually disabled or you are not. There are different degrees, and every degree, every significant difference in terms of quantitative differences from the norm also is accompanied by functional differences. A child who is 1 standard deviation below the norm may be slightly on that continuum, but is in the regular classroom and is succeeding, and with special help and assistance, of course. But they're not considered special ed. And the children who are 2 standard deviations below the norm are significantly different from the average population that is dealt with in the regular class. And so they need to have specially trained teachers at 2 SDs below the norm. Well, there's a big functional difference between kids who are only 1 and kids who are 2. But then if you keep going, if you go to the 3rd standard deviation below the norm, we're talking about kids of about a 55 IQ level. And they are functionally different from children who are at 70 IQ. And they have a different terminology for that population. So there is mildly, moderately, severely, and profoundly disabled. And the same thing applies at the other end. If you have children who are one standard deviation above the norm, that's not special needs. Those are the kids that could be considered, in some contexts, mildly gifted or mildly advanced. And that's where our talent pool comes from. These are the happy campers that teachers love to work with, and many teachers are in the same one standard deviation above to two standard deviations above the norm. They're in that realm, so there's a good connect between teacher and student. When you get to the gifted range, now we're dealing with special education. These are individuals at two standard deviations above the norm who are significantly different from the kids in the regular classroom and need something special. And as you go further up, 3 standard deviations above the norm would be like a 145 IQ. That is huge. That's an enormous discrepancy between them and average, just like 55 IQ is an enormous discrepancy between that group and average. Well, then you go to 4 standard deviations above the norm, and that's 160 IQ. And that is equivalent to 4 standard deviations below the norm, which is 40 IQ. When we say, we're going to mainstream all kids, we don't mainstream kids in the 40 IQ range because their needs are so different. They are not even going to be able to join the workforce. They're going to need supervision continuously for the rest of their lives. I deal with kids who are not only 4 standard deviations, but 5 standard deviations above the norm. 75 IQ is the new definition of profoundly gifted. Now, profoundly gifted has been watered down to be 145 IQ in some contexts, but that was not how it began. It began, people thought of PG as 160, and we now call that the exceptionally gifted range based on Meryl Gross's work in Australia, where she talked about the exceptionally gifted child, and she was talking about them at 160 IQ. Now, when I created PG Retreat, it was for kids in the 160 range, and we called it PG because that was at the time the definition of profoundly gifted. And believe it or not, when the Davidson Foundation started, the Davidson Young Scholar Program, it was for kids in that range. But then when the IQ tests didn't go that high, the current ones, they changed it to 145, but kept profoundly gifted. So profoundly gifted in people's minds means anywhere between 145 and 180 or higher. But
Okay.
if you look at it from a psychometric perspective, when they were putting the Stanford A5 together, that intelligence scale, I was on the advisory board, and John Wasserman, who was the project director, asked me to put together an international committee to determine nomenclature in the higher realms.
Okay.
Meryl Gross from Australia. I had Karen Rogers, who was a premier researcher in the United States. All these people who specialized in that population. And so we determined that highly gifted was 145, 3 standard deviations above the norm, exceptionally gifted 160, and profoundly gifted actually 175. Since we opened our doors in June of 1979, we've actually found over 1,000 children above 160 IQ. There are many, many, many more of these very exceptionally gifted children than anyone dreams of or wants to know about.
I'm wondering, I'm thinking about from the parent perspective, when a lot of the testing, at least here in Colorado and a lot of other states, cognitive testing is group testing, it's COGAT, it's INGAT, it's INNAT. Families are not necessarily being given more than a percentile rank. And so what can families do if they're thinking, well, is my child profoundly gifted? Like they have 99th percentile. What does that really mean? What should they do?
It means they've gone to the top of that test, and they need a test with a higher ceiling to find out just how smart their child is. 98th percentile is 130 IQ. 99th percentile is the highly gifted range at 145, and that's where the group tests end. And that is really pretty much the highest score you could get on the Wechsler scales, the WISC and the WIPSI, until we developed extended norms with the publisher for the WISC-5 and the WISC-4. But you couldn't really get much more of a score than 145 or maybe 150 if you got everything right. But what that means is the test is too low a ceiling to capture the full strength of your child's abilities, and your child needs an individual IQ test with a higher ceiling. The WISC-5, the ceiling of the test is 16 years, 11 months. So we recommend that children take the test as early as 6 years, 0 months, because there's more room at the top for them to show the full strength of their abilities. We like the differential ability scale, the second edition differential ability scale, that's the DAS-2, has a higher ceiling. It's 17 years, 11 months. And
Okay.
it generates scores up into the 1 to 170. But I also use the old test that's only good for PG retreat, really. And it is a test that was developed at the very beginning of the testing industry. And the forms of it are still available. And it is the Stanford Binet LM, which goes up to age 23.
Okay.
And we only give that test, we give it in a brown paper bag. We only give that test to kids who get to the top 99th percentile on a current IQ test. And then we want to find out what are we dealing with. And so we will give them a test with a higher ceiling. That's the test that goes all the way to 300 IQ.
Wow, how interesting. I did not know about that. I'm wondering what you've seen in your work as some common misconceptions about profoundly gifted children, whether it's families or schools, and maybe how that impacts the way they are supported or if they are supported.
Yes, there are a lot of them. One is that there are very, very few of them in the population. When we hear 180 IQ and we look at an old norm chart, it says those kids are 1 in a million. But from the very day we opened our doors in Denver, we were finding so many kids in that 180 range that we, in the first 2 years of the Gifted Development Center's existence, we had tested as many children in the 180 range as there should be in the entire United States.
Based on their 1 in a million.
So that led me to do some research to find out what really was this population all about in terms of incidence. And I did some studies of incidence and went back to the earlier research by other researchers, and they had found that there was another hump at the top of the bell curve for that exceptionally gifted population, and the hump was at 150.
Okay.
We always have known that there's a hump at the lower end, that it's a trimodal distribution. Because at the bottom, there's congenital disabilities. And so there's more kids at the third standard deviation below the norm than there should be if the normal curve were true. And so they've had to put in this little hump at the bottom. What we don't know is that there's a little hump at the top.
Yeah.
And that means that there are more, and have been in every data set, more kids in the 150, 160, 170, 180, and above range in the population than anyone's been aware of. And all the data sets have shown it.
That is so interesting. It makes me think about the issue of elitism in gifted education. And I wonder if that gets worse when we talk about profoundly gifted students. And what I mean by that is for people outside of gifted education, regular just educators who are maybe not as well researched are maybe less likely to consider that the needs of a profoundly gifted student would be different from a gifted student, and whether or not that is impacted by this elitism. What are your thoughts on that?
I think elitism is an issue here. I think elitism is a major issue when we're talking about should we have provisions for the gifted, period, the entire range of gifted, because is that an elitist concept? Is it an elitist concept that some children were born with higher intelligence than others? These are elitist concepts, but they don't affect the profoundly gifted. They affect the mildly and moderately gifted, because people feel that they're already advantaged in the race to fame, in the race to success. And if giftedness is all about who's going to be successful in adult life, well, it's not the profoundly gifted you have to worry about. They're so off the charts that they're not even, many of them, in school because schools don't even deal with them. Most of those kids are homeschooled.
Right. Yes, because our public school system is not built for them.
When
Yeah,
we're homeschooling, elitism is not an issue.
that's true. That is true.
When we're dealing with the other end of the spectrum and we're dealing with children who are way off, way below, we're not talking about school, not in regular schools. And so you're not giving them special benefits because they're 4 standard deviations below the norm. You're giving them appropriate accommodations from teachers who are endorsed to work with that population. That's why I feel that a special education perspective helps me to understand that we're dealing with increasing needs on both ends of the spectrum as the child diverges more and more and more from the norm. So if we look at a regular classroom, if 100 is the average, the majority of the children, 65% or more in a regular classroom, will be 1 standard deviation below the norm to 1 standard deviation above the norm. So that would be like 85 IQ to 115. Then your high achievers will be from 115 to 130. Is gifted education elitist? No, because if you understand that gifted education is for individuals with special needs who need a different type of education than they can get in the regular classroom, and that they're spending most of their time in the regular classroom waiting for other children to learn, where they've already mastered the curriculum before they entered the classroom. If you look at that as elitist because somebody is getting more opportunities for advancement, well, if you're doing a good gifted program, the rest of the population can't do the work done in gifted education. It's too advanced, it's too complex, it's too abstract. If you're doing frills and you're just having fun and games in gifted education and you're making it available to kids in the 120 range, maybe you've got a case there. Maybe you could be taken to task that your program is elitist because at 120 IQ, you cannot prove that these children are significantly different from the norm and need a significantly different educational experience. So elitism isn't really a problem for the profoundly gifted. It's a problem for what type of program are you creating? Are you able to create a defensible program for children who really require something different from what the regular classroom can offer?
I think that's a great point and a good thing for people to reflect on.
When we're going higher than that, and then you look at the other end of the spectrum, it just becomes common sense that the more advanced the child is, the more they're going to need special accommodations and teachers who are trained to work with their needs, just like at the other end of the spectrum. So profoundly gifted kids, their misunderstanding is not about elitism. Where misunderstanding is everybody thinks that today that they're just part of the neurodiversity piece and they're all on the spectrum. Well, they're not. There are a lot of autistic kids who are profoundly gifted, but there are also an awful lot of profoundly gifted people in this world who are not autistic. And to mush them together and say, well, if you're profoundly gifted, you're autistic. That is one of the major current misunderstandings by doctors, by parents. I've heard individuals, lay people use this and think, oh, well, they must be autistic if they're gifted, especially if they're profoundly gifted. Not true.
Not true. Yeah. That's huge. I've heard that as well and given me pause too. Like, no, these are different things. Like you said, yes.
Well, there are a lot of quite exceptional children. And when we started our center, we were the testing center for all of the schools for the gifted because they didn't have psychologists.
Okay. Yeah.
Even then, when the only reason the parents were bringing their child was to get them into a summer program, an enrichment program at DU, or a full day program, maybe Macintosh Academy or local school, the schools in Denver for the gifted that were the oldest schools. When we were trying to get kids into those schools, even then, we were finding an inordinate number of these 160, 170, 180, 190 IQs. And here is another thing that has been a real bugaboo for me. The press, the belief system that we have in our country at large, is that giftedness, especially exceptionally giftedness, is a masculine thing. And there are no women geniuses, only men. And I have seen articles written by reputable reporters who just only talk about males.
Yeah.
Women are only listed in sidebars.
Yeah, that's
They're
true.
not important, they're not central, and there are no women geniuses. What our research showed by studying this population was that there are as many profoundly gifted females as there are profoundly gifted males. Females that are most likely to be overlooked. They're not even brought in for testing. I had
Yeah.
a situation where a family in Colorado brought their son for testing because he was acting out in school, and they were really worried about them, and they brought their daughter, listen to this, as a decoy.
As a decoy.
That was the term they used.
Wow.
They didn't want him to think there was something wrong with him, and that's why they were testing him. So they brought both of their kids so that he would think that this is just what their family is doing now. The decoy tested above 180 IQ, and her parents did not know that she was gifted.
Wow.
That is a big misperception.
Yes.
And in international, 2/3 of the children brought for testing anywhere in the world are male.
Wow.
So a whole lot of exceptionally and profoundly gifted kids have been overlooked. And then if you go back to the early research, 1910 in Germany, the highest scores were attained by females.
Okay.
And this has been overlooked and ignored.
Well, I think that's a really important point for everyone to consider. Truly. I'm also wondering, through your experience and research, have you found that there's a correlation between the higher the IQ, the more risk for depression, suicide, etc.? Is there a correlation there?
We don't have good data, but I can tell you, if you would accept clinical research and the fact that I've been in business for 46 years and we've tested over 6,600 children, I think that's a pretty good data set.
Mm-hmm.
We found that, yes, the more different you are and the less you're understood, the more you're misunderstood, the more you're pushed into a framework that doesn't work for you, the more anxiety, the more depression, and the more risk for suicide there is. And I did a little study when I was on faculty at the University of Denver. I left there in 1985, so this is a very old study. I had a consortium at that time of individuals like yourself. They were gifted coordinators in the Denver metropolitan area, and they came together. And I asked them to fill out a survey. And I asked them how many years they had been in the field as one of my research questions. Those who had not been in the field for more than 5 years said that they had seen no suicides in their gifted population. They had seen very little suicide attempts and no increase in suicidal ideation among the gifted in their limited experience with gifted. But once they had been in the field for 5 years or more, they saw an increase in suicidal ideation. They saw an increase in suicide attempts, and some of them had seen suicides.
And why do you think that is, based on just a time difference? Do you think they were just not looking for it or just oblivious to it?
They didn't have the experience. The more experienced professionals, people like yourself, had come across this and had recognized it. So I'll ask you, have you seen in the population you've worked with a higher incidence of suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, or actual suicides, completed suicides?
Yes, I have.
Well, if you ask a novice, they will say no because they haven't had your range of experience.
Yeah, it's true. If I look back to when I was first beginning in gifted education, I would have said no. But yeah, it's definitely something I've seen over time. And I think something that we need to continue to talk about, and also a benefit to getting tested, and not just the test, but getting support sooner, so students and families can understand themselves better and work through how to just cope with who they are and live a happy life, whatever that looks like for them. Like you're saying, it doesn't mean that you are the most successful person in the world just because you have some high IQ. It's really so individualized on what makes you happy, what makes you tick outside of school.
When we're looking at success and we look at it through the materialistic values that are in the United States and in the world at large, we can see that there is very little relationship between financial success and intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
We can see that all
Yes.
around us. And yet, the success model permeates gifted education. It permeates academia. It permeates teacher training in this field. The purpose of gifted education is to create eminent adults. Nonsense. What percentage of the gifted population become eminent? And what percentage of the female gifted population become? 98% of eminent individuals are male. Eminence is not how you look at giftedness. It doesn't lead to happiness. And that success model, you don't have to be more than 120 IQ or even that. I mean, we see financially successful people who are much lower in IQ.
Yeah, there's a lot more to it than in your IQ.
So the success model is nonsensical.
Yes.
We do
Yeah.
not apply it at the other end of the spectrum. We don't
True.
use the term the intellectually disabled are our national resource. We wouldn't allot funding based on what they can do for us.
Yeah.
We allot funding based on what their needs are. And the needs at the other end of the spectrum, at the gifted end of the spectrum, are just as great. They're just not understood or believed. And we don't even believe that these kids exist because the tests don't go very high. And because most kids have group tests, we think gifted ends at the 99th percentile and that
Right.
there aren't any differences in kids above that. So what if it's 99.999 percentile? But it does make a difference. And these individuals have phenomenal interests and absolute passions that need to be supported. That's one of the reasons why so many of the parents of these children homeschool. So to me, it's not a curriculum and instruction issue. It's a psychological issue.
Sure.
The more different you are from the norm, the more at risk you are. The risk for being misunderstood, the risk for being ostracized, the risk for being made fun of, the risk for not being invited to a birthday party, the risk for not having any friends. These are major psychological issues that lead to depression.
Absolutely. And I'm wondering, through your experience, what for our families who are listening who have profoundly gifted students and they're trying to find the right educational environment for their child, what do you think are some things they should be considering or asking as they investigate, whether or not homeschooling or private school or trying to accelerate in public school? What should they be considering?
They have to have more information than they can get from a group test. One of the things that they can get from an individual achievement test is a grade equivalent that can let them know that their child might be 8 grade levels above in mathematics. And so if you accelerate them 1 year, it doesn't even touch what they are capable of. So they need more information to start with. Then they need to ask, how many children in this IQ range do you have in this school? And how do you serve them? They have to ask those questions. We ask those questions. I did a study of all of the schools for the gifted and found which schools had the most kids above 150. And I would tell parents, your child is more likely to find friends at this school than at that school.
I think that's a huge thing to consider. And also just the question of what are you doing to support students like mine? And really to dig into that question and ask follow-up questions and not let people answer that with a surface level. We meet all child's needs. No, I need a little bit more than that.
If you had a child who was at the other end of the spectrum, who had 40 IQ, and would that serve? We meet all children's needs? A child who's 40 IQ? I don't think so. That answer doesn't apply, does it?
Absolutely not. And I think sometimes parents can feel uncomfortable when it feels like a privilege to be profoundly gifted from the receiving end. And people think that it's not appropriate to ask for more. And parents should absolutely be asking those questions. And their child does deserve an education that fits them. But I think sometimes parents struggle with even bringing up, hey, this is what my child is doing. This is how advanced they are because of bad experiences with either teachers or admin not believing them, or just not being willing to support or investigate what that could look like at their school. And so, just a big encouragement to all families who are working through that to continue to ask those hard questions.
Let's talk a little bit more about the question of privilege.
Yeah.
And that ties in with the question of elitism. Okay. When we use a different definition of giftedness, that's not elitism based, it's not privilege based, it's not success based, and it's not achievement based, but it's based on the fact that the child has asynchronous development. The more gifted they are, the more asynchrony there is. So the simplest way for me to explain this is if we go back to the mental age that Binet came up with when he developed the IQ test for children. A child's mental age tells you what they're capable of learning and how fast they learn it and how abstract their minds are and what kind of connections they make among all the ideas they have in their head. Whereas their chronological age predicts the size of their feet, the size of their hands, and what their feet and their hands and their body is capable of doing. So there has always, from the very beginning of the field, been an asynchrony, a discrepancy between mental age and physical age. Always. There's never been a concept of giftedness in children without that discrepancy. The discrepancy gets bigger as you get more and more profoundly gifted. So at 160 IQ, the discrepancy between the jokes that you're likely to think are funny because you're a 9-year-old boy and what you can do with your hands and feet versus what your mind can do, a different model of teaching for those discrepant strengths and weaknesses. And if you define the child as asynchronous, no parent is going to say, my child's more asynchronous than your child. It's not an elitist concept. It's not a privilege-based concept. It's a needs-based concept. Privilege and elitism are achievement-based concepts and success model concepts. If you go with giftedness as the high achievement, the high marks, the high scores, how this child is performing in school, then you can be worried about privilege and worried about elitism, but not when you're talking about different needs, not when you're talking about asynchronous development. The higher the IQ, the more asynchronous the child, and the more education has to mold itself to the child because the child at 180 IQ cannot mold him or herself to the school. They cannot. No more than a child with a 20 IQ could mold themselves to an environment.
Absolutely. What resources or encouragement for places to get support can you share for families of profoundly gifted students who are looking for more community or more support?
Well, there are two that are called for profoundly gifted that are actually for highly gifted kids. One is the Davidson Institute, and the Davidson Young Scholar program is for kids at 145 or higher on specific composite scores on individual IQ tests. And that is one large, nationally known, only U.S., it's a nationally known program of support for children in that range. Support for parents, support for kids, resources available to the parents. And so that's the one that's known the most. A takeoff on the Davidson is Epsilon Camp. And that's also for children in that 145 IQ range who happen to be mathematically talented and want to have advanced mathematics. So if you have a mathematically talented child who is in the highly gifted range or beyond, Epsilon Camp is a second support service. But if you think your child is one standard deviation beyond that or close to it, then where the support network is PG Retreat. And that is for essentially kids who are around the 160 range or higher, but they also look at portfolios. They also look at developmental milestones. They look at recommendations. They look at what this child is capable of that the parents can describe. So even if the IQ score isn't exactly 160, if it's close enough that the family will get in. It's international, and it provides a support system, a summer retreat. Only one child in the family has to have that score in order for the whole family to qualify. It's a 5-day summer retreat with services for parents and kids. And it's a year-long. There's a mother's group. There's a father's group that meet monthly. There are regional groups that meet. And so there's a parent chat room. There's opportunities for kids to connect with each other. And that's where they really find their true peers.
Thank you for that. I will link all of those programs right beneath our video here on YouTube so people can check those out if that's of interest. I think that's really helpful. Building community in the profoundly gifted family support world is instrumental to not just the child's well-being, but the entire family's well-being. So thank you for sharing that.
You're trying to raise a child who is so atypical.
Yeah.
That all the advice you're given is based on children who aren't like your child.
Yeah.
None of it works. It's so frustrating for the parents. I have tremendous admiration for parents of gifted children. They're the people that I respect the most and work with the most. I've seen parents who they'll live in 2 different cities if necessary to get their child's needs met. I can't begin to tell you the heroism that I've seen in parents. It's remarkable.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up here, I'm just wondering what hopeful shifts you've seen and what's really giving you hope and optimism for the future of our profoundly gifted students.
Well, this is going to blow your mind, but I think there are more and more and more of them being born every day. And the fact that they are becoming known to people because there's more of them. And because we have internet, which we didn't have when Lita Hollingworth was on the planet, she found 12 kids of 180 higher. I've found 100 females that were 180 or higher.
Mm-hmm.
They find each other on internet. There are parent support groups. There's lots of opportunity for them not to feel as isolated as they once did. And the fact that there are more and more coming means that they are becoming a force. That's my hope.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you. I hope I can have you back on.
I would love it.
So thank you. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.
This episode of Exceptionally Speaking is brought to you by Hex 24 Press, where education meets imagination. I founded Hex 24 Press in 2024 to uplift educator voices and provide a publishing home for myself and other educators to bring our work into the world. You can find more information about today's guests, including links to their resources and services, at hex24press.com. Thank you for supporting educators, independent creators, and small business. We're so glad you're here.